I learned grief as if it were a language taught to me in fragments. Broken syllables, half-remembered words. After Jonah died, the world around me kept talking. Everyone using their familiar dialects of business and brunch. And I moved through it, translating their lightness into something I no longer recognized. I was 23 and a woman with an ache that fit into the hollow of my ribs, like a small animal that refused to leave. I had served other people plates, filled coffee cups, counted cash until dusk, and gone home to the quiet apartment that smelled of lemon, cleaner and old hand-me-down blankets. I had been a mother first, everything else second, waitress, shift leader, night shift guardian of a life that demanded round-the-clock attention. I had rearranged my whole being around Jonah's oxygen tanks and medication, schedules. I had given my savings, my sleep, my teeth to his care. I had learned how to read machines the way other people read faces. In the months after he was gone, I learned other things. I learned the precise geometry of the sun through my kitchen window at 2 in the afternoon. I learned the number of steps between my apartment and the late-night diner where I could sit in a booth and pretend I was looking at a menu. I learned how to fold a shirt in 2 seconds. I learned that grief, when uninvited, started as a slow leak and could become a flood overnight. I learned how quiet the world could get when the elastic tether that had tied me to someone was cut. I had, in practical terms, no one. My mother, Gloria, had been the kind of woman who had palms always, clean and a schedule for mourning. She had kept Jonah's tiny sweater folded in a white box and sent me a wreath that came with a 6-paragraph card. Sorrow, arranged like a press release. My father, Ethan, met loss with an easier face. Avoidance. My sister, Taylor, resembled a shadow that arrived only to block light and then complained about the chill. They had been distant when Jonah needed them. They had offered dishes and platitudes in the immediate aftermath of his diagnosis, then stopped answering the calls that came at 3 in the morning when tubes clogged, and I had to fight the hospital bureaucracy for a bed. In those weeks, I found out how many human hands wanted to touch my life, until the time came to write checks, claim insurance, or sign a form. When the checks were needed, they retreated. When we fought for oxygen, they were busy. After Jonah died, their absences were a brittle soundtrack of explanations. Work commitments, inconvenient travel, emotional fatigue. I accepted their reasons, the way people accept the weather, because there is no use in arguing with a storm. I rebuilt my life into a small, stubborn shrine of routine. Coffee. 3 shifts a week that allowed me to pay the rent. Late-night walks that smelled faintly of someone else's laundry. And a stack of Jonah's drawings, crayon suns and lopsided hearts that I kept under my mattress. I moved through the days with the precision of someone carrying a fragile thing. I was tired in my bones. I was wary, but I was not helpless. So when they came back, I should have known something was wrong. It started with a text. "We miss you. Call when you can. Mom." There it was, simple and plain. And at first I thought of the wreath in its pristine box. I imagined the polite grief they had once offered like a borrowed shawl. I thought of the way my mother had photographed herself at the funeral, hands folded, head bowed at the exact angle that read, "devastated," in the way society expected. 2 days later, there was a voicemail, breathy and precise. "Honey, we're in town. We were thinking, maybe we could talk about Jonah's affairs. You don't have to be alone." My chest tightened in the way a fist tightened around a fragile spool. They arrived on a wet, late summer day. My sister Taylor stepped down first from the car with the kind of high-heeled certainty that has a sound all its own, like someone stepping into a camera frame. She wore a dress that chose the light for her, flattering, carefully nonchalant. My mother's hands were perfectly manicured, her lipstick a practiced promise, and my father sat in the front seat, like someone who had forgotten the reason for the road. They brought casseroles in lidded pans and a solemn stack of sympathy cards. They sat at my kitchen table as if it belonged to them. I made coffee, my fingers memorizing the motion. They ate like people who understood etiquette. They told me they had flown in because they needed to check on things, because they had thought about Jonah every day. They spoke in small, coordinated strokes of sympathy, and the odd contours of their absence slid into an easier narrative. Mom, Gloria, kept watching me the way a stage manager watches an actor, assessing response, gauging whether I would nod at the right moments, Father, Ethan, kept rubbing his thumb along the corner of a sympathy card as if it were a remote control that could change channels. Taylor kept smiling in a way that implied she had always been the better daughter. It would have been easy, one more time, to let them in and smooth things over. I had a small trust fund, the result of me careful with the payment policies and the way insurance dispersed Jonah's remaining accounts. It was the kind of thing other people's lawyers told them to make sure they had done right. A small residual in a child's account, earmarked for schooling, for care. I had it moved into my name out of practicality, because who else would steward it? I did it because I trusted no one else would have cared for Jonah as I had. I had kept my head down and allowed no one near the accounts until I thought I was ready. I did not tell my family the full amount, not because I thought them thieves, but because I had always needed a boundary. They came with soft hands and sharper eyes. "We just want to help," my mother said. "There's paperwork, Madison. No one should have to deal with that while grieving." It sounded like charity. It sounded like a cloak. She pressed a legal pad toward me like a test. "It would make us feel better if we could be co-trustees. You know, so things don't slip." The words were polite. The intent had an edge. Later, when I replayed their visits like an old song, the melody felt familiar, a careful silence broken by long exhalations that made me feel like the guilty one for living. But in the moment, I let it be. I signed a small authorization so they could see the account details. I gave them access to the accountant who had handled Jonah's billing. I did it because I was tired, and because the hunger to be seen, to be comforted by the family that had not been there, was still human and tender. They took the access and used it like someone sharpening a blade. The next week, after they had helped me by calling doctors and arranging a memorial service they liked, I started getting notices, little flags on automatic payments, unusual withdrawals. My bank called with an alert. Copies of disbursement forms were downloaded from the trust portal from an IP. Address registered to my mother's name. A transfer was scheduled, later canceled. A line item that read medical expense had been inflated with a vendor I had never heard of. I could see the pattern in the white light of account histories. Curious, bureaucratic, efficient. Conversations that had been soft became invasive. My mother sidled into questions about my capacity. "How have you been sleeping?" she asked one afternoon, voice honeyed. "Are you sure you're making the right decisions? Is this too much?" The implication was a spider web. I was too raw, too fragile, too alone to manage his affairs responsibly. They planted seeds, innocuous questions, layered with insinuation, so the garden they were cultivating would bloom into doubt. They offered to help with the paperwork, and that help came with forms, stamped and notarized, that would place me under a conservatorship unless I acquiesced. Taylor, my sister, hovered like a satellite looking for gravitational pull. She would text me late at night with a selfie and a smiling caption, then the next morning send me a barrage of messages about financial management articles she had read, quoted phrases like incompetent grieving with clinical distance. She flattered and belittled, sometimes in the same sentence. "You're so brave to be doing this alone, Maddie," she wrote. The text felt like a trap disguised as praise. It was as if every message was graded for its potential to make me feel small. I did not trust my instincts at first. The world spins faster when you are convinced of your own disarray. I felt, I confess, fumbling. Some nights the panic would come in high arcs, bright and dangerous. I would scroll through my phone and see messages I had not sent, drafts opened and saved, cloud folders that had been accessed by accounts I did not recognize. I could feel the presence of others in the frame of my life, like a ghost standing too close. It took a wrong signature, a document that arrived in the mail with my printed name, where no signature had been necessary, for me to know they had crossed a line. The form had been submitted to the county clerk, an application to appoint a conservator to manage the affairs of Madison Hayes, alleged incapacitated person. It read in bureaucratic bareness. My stomach dropped. I called the clerk and they confirmed. An application had been filed on behalf of my mother and sister. They had cited vague clinical terms: bereavement, impaired judgment, inability to manage funds, recent loss impacting mental stability. In the bureaucratic geometry of their petitions, my sorrow had become a diagnosis. I stood at the sink and let the water run while my hands trembled. The world felt like a theater of hands, some holding me like a fragile prop, others gripping the ropes that controlled the curtains. In one hand, I had the life I had built, threaded with thrift and bone. In the other, the legal form was an accusation. I could have folded and signed away my autonomy simply to make them stop. I could have given them the keys and the accounts and moved to a place where their presence would feel less intrusive. But something, a small, stubborn ember, would not let me. I called Claire Benton, my friend from the diner, a block over who had once volunteered to take depositions for a community legal clinic. Claire had a jaw that made honesty happen in rooms where people preferred pleasant lies. She wore glasses the way other people wore armor. She came to my kitchen and sat at my table with a takeout cup, her fingers drumming the rim. "You need someone who knows the system," she said. "And you need someone who will look at their filings and say, 'This smells like manipulation.' We did what you do when you have a hole in the hull of a small ship. We plugged and patched." Claire filed an emergency motion to dismiss the conservatorship petition on the grounds that the application was made in bad faith and was supported by falsified documentation. She subpoenaed the IP logs from the trust portal. She issued a demand for communications records. Claire moved with the mechanical calm of someone who had rehearsed this dance 1,000 times. The courtroom was a choreography she knew intimately. Preparing for the hearing was its own excavation of wounds. The family, predictably, positioned themselves as concerned caretakers. My mother's statements were polished to the point of performance. "I have always been the rock in our family," she said in a deposition, voice honeyed, intending to read as motherly fortitude. My father's statements were thin, an echo of whatever my mother said. Taylor's testimony read like a script edited for maximum. Sympathy, times they had visited, fingers they had held, bad nights and whispered reassurances. The fact that they had not been there when Jonah was alive seemed to evaporate under their practiced grief. They had honed the art of being believable. But we had artifacts that glinted with the truth. Claire presented a series of cold, clinical things that, when assembled, told a story far less charitable than the one my family had rehearsed. There were IP logs showing access to the trust account from 2 distinct locations. One traced to the home address listed under my mother's name, another to a device registered under my sister's social media account. There were metadata-stamped emails showing that the conservatorship application had been drafted and uploaded in segments from those same locations over the course of a week. There were bank statements that registered a withdrawn consultation fee, routed to a shell account with links to a company that, when followed, led to a tax attorney my mother had once used, a person who, in past disclosures, had advised on estate consolidations that had left beneficiaries with fees and little else. We had voicemail transcripts showing my mother urging a clerk to hurry things along, and a screenshot of a text message where Taylor had advised, "Make sure you put impaired judgment. It sounds official." There was a clip that felt, for reasons I could not immediately name, like a live wire. One evening, when I was trying to understand how they had accessed my account, I remembered a broken security camera in the building lobby downstairs. The landlord had told me years ago that the system stored footage in a cloud folder accessible by building management. Claire subpoenaed the management's logs, and we got a request filled. A 5-minute clip from the morning the conservatorship forms had been printed. What we saw in those 5 minutes made the courtroom sharp with a new kind of focus. The camera captured my mother and sister arriving at the building, Taylor with a briefcase, Gloria with an insulated bag. They signed in at the front desk. The timestamps showed them pressing an elevator button, stepping out on my floor, lingering in the hallway with their hands on the door as if to measure the distance between knock and entry. Taylor glanced at a smartphone and typed, over and over, fingers quick, then tucked the phone into her pocket. The camera caught them leaving with a small cardboard envelope clipped closed. The motion was casual. The smallness of their action made the cruelty of intent feel colder. Claire put the clip on a small screen in the courtroom, and the gallery leaned forward with a sound like breath. It was cinematic in the way small betrayals always are, banal, unremarkable, yet when strung together they formed a rope. The clip showed them walking past a neighbor, a woman who, when called to testify, confirmed seeing the pair on that morning. Their conversation a low murmur about forms and getting things sorted. The neighbor said Taylor had asked if the neighbor could sign for a package, an empty, practical question that later acquired a sinister sheen, but the truth was not an object. We had to conjure so much as a constellation. We could now point to the account logs, the voicemail, the neighbor's testimony, the clip. Together they read like a puzzle whose picture was finally becoming legible. It was not simply that they had wanted to help. It was that they had engineered a legal chokehold time to take advantage of the most vulnerable period in my life. I sat in the courtroom with my hands folded and let the evidence do what my pleading could not. I did not cry. People assumed that was because I was numb. The truth was more complicated. I had cried in the nights that followed Jonah's death until tears had no shape. In the courtroom there was a fierce, flattened focus that felt like something closer to survival. Claire's voice, when she spoke, cut the air cleanly. She walked the judge through a patient, careful sequence, connecting money transfers to emails to the neighbor's observations. She asked the clerk to read entries from the conservatorship application and then juxtapose them against surveillance logs and IP addresses. She had a witness, a systems analyst from the bank, explain how metadata works, how the sequence of access painted a picture of coordinated entry, not a solitary, charitable attempt to help a grieving daughter. She called my neighbor, my landlady, the clerk. She presented the little things that add up to a crime of intimacy. That day in the courtroom was cinematic in the way that it had to be. A stage, lines read, evidentiary close-ups. The family's witnesses, when it came time for them to testify under the light, seemed smaller than they had in my kitchen, their words brittle. My mother's voice, which had wanted to claim the moral high ground, now sounded like an actor overreaching. My father's testimony fell apart under precise questioning about which bank accounts he knew about. Taylor, when asked under oath how she had accessed the trust portal, faltered. Her practiced face crumpled into defensiveness and then into a kind of animal panic. "I just wanted to help," she said. The rawness of that sentence was almost a confession. Help as a veneer for possession. At a point I did not expect. The courtroom brimmed with a low, combustible noise. Taylor said something, an aside, meant to fluster. That contradicted an email that had been entered into the record. Claire held up the email on a glossy sheet, and the judge called for a recess. In that quiet, I watched my mother's hands quiver. I watched a woman who had made choreographed grief, her currency sink into a corner where the market would no longer accept her tender offers. The most brutal moment came when my mother, in an attempt to salvage the narrative, read aloud a passage from a private journal entry I had never written. It was a falsified note, something designed to show my incapacity. We had by then subpoenaed my own therapist's files to prove that the evidence they offered was contrived. The court had a recording the family had made, an edited montage of a tearful night, cut to imply breakdown. Claire, with surgical calm, played for the judge the full, unedited recording from that same night. My voice steady, refusing to be coddled into helplessness, and then the final seconds where I asked a hospice nurse a question about whether Jonah would be comfortable. It was raw and tender and did not read as instability. It read as a woman trying to manage an impossible situation. The montage the family had created was the lie. The full passage proved coherence. As the judge watched the exhibits, Judge Cortlandt, watched with a gaze that read as both thorough and tired. His hand rested on the bench. He rolled the papers and looked up. The courtroom, filled with the scrape and shuffle of legal movement, felt like a held breath. When the ruling came, it landed like a verdict and a benediction. The judge dismissed the conservatorship petition with prejudice. He found that the petitioners had filed in bad faith and noted the inconsistencies in their affidavits and the fraudulent content in the application. He ordered an immediate injunction, preventing them from accessing the trust accounts or contacting me directly. He initiated an inquiry into the executor, who had assisted in the initial filings, and ordered law enforcement to investigate the transfers that were flagged. The ruling read like restoration and acknowledgement in one. He affirmed my capacity to manage Jonah's accounts and explicitly condemned the family for what he named attempted financial exploitation under the guise of familial concern. For a long moment after the gavel fell, sound returned to the court in uneven waves. A woman behind me sobbed, some private, long-buried thing. Claire clapped my shoulder with an intimacy that did not say, "Victory?" so much as, "You are still here." The family left with a kind of stunned speed. My mother's face, which once wore martyrdom as an accessory, had gone pale. The roguishness of her sympathy had been stripped down to its mechanics. It was the public affirmation I had not known I needed. The ruling didn't make Jonah come back. It did not fill the hollow. But it did something else. It named the thefts of dignity and set them to rights. In court, my grief had been weaponized against me. In court, that weapon was turned over, a counterfeit, and revealed. When you stand in a room where a judge says your name and the word competent in the same breath, the syllables feel like light on the floor. Afterward, after the dust of the courtroom settles, there was a long, odd quiet that felt like a clearing. The community that had gathered in those small, everyday moments for me came forward in increments. The diner owner who had changed my schedule when I needed rest, Rosa Kim, the woman who had trained me the first week I bussed tables and who had once been brusque and competitive, showed up with takeout and a shoulder. Rosa and I had clashed over tips and inventory that first month. She had the kind of bluntness that prided itself on survival. But the nights we had shared cleaning up after closing had been a slow reveal, a woman with a ring of tiredness around her eyes and an indignant loyalty. She stayed. She came with soup and a hug you could breathe into. Neighbors offered space for Jonah's drawings to be part of a memorial. A local youth center offered a pamphlet-lined room for me to hold a small fundraiser in Jonah's name. Claire helped me establish a small foundation with funds from an anonymous donor who had been watching, a scholarship for caregivers, specifically for single parents of chronically ill children who were forced out of work to provide care. The donor wanted anonymity, but the effect was simple and luminous. There would be a place for small, necessary things, emergency funds for families who found themselves juggling life and laptops and IVs. Building the foundation felt like learning to knit with brittle yarn. Each stitch was a negotiation between memory and hope. I had many small, fumbling moments. I wrote grant proposals with hands that trembled at the commas, and Claire would read them and circle phrases that needed steadiness. We launched with a modest endowment. The trust accounts that Jonah had been entitled to remained fully under my control, and that, after the judge's ruling, felt like a moral responsibility I did not take lightly. I organized a fundraiser at a park Jonah had loved. We set up tables with blue paper suns clumsily cut from construction paper, the shapes echoing the ones he had drawn. People came, an unassuming crowd of neighbors and fellow waitstaff and the kind of strangers who had become allies. They brought cakes and stories and donations wrapped in kindness. The work of building something in Jonah's name became a path out of the dark. It was not a path away from him, but a path alongside the memory. I found that helping others gave my grief a shape that was neither a prison nor a performance. It became an act. I taught a workshop on navigating hospital systems. I spoke in small rooms where exhausted parents sat with coffee-stained shirts and the weariness of people who had given everything. They thanked me for the honesty of my mistakes. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they laughed. It was messy and beautiful. My sister, after being ordered to surrender any access to my accounts, tried to open a dialogue. There were messages, apologies that read like drafts by someone who glanced at the edges of compassion. My mother called once, refusing to leave voicemails, the phone clicking as if a stage light had been turned off. The law didn't strip them of family membership. It simply enforced boundaries that had never existed when they had been most needed. Their absence, I realized, had been a kind of teaching. I had, by surviving without them, discovered a capacity I did not expect. The court had not just protected my funds, it had named my autonomy. In time, small gestures began to mean something different. Rosa, who had once been blunt with me in the kitchen, became an unexpected ally. She volunteered hours for the foundation, printing flyers and arranging tables. She brought her mother one Thanksgiving, and we all made too much stuffing. She taught me how to armor a smile so it would not be mistaken for weakness. She said to me one afternoon, less a counsel than a statement, "You don't owe them anything you don't give on purpose." It was practical and incandescent. It felt like permission. I started sleeping more. I started making coffee not to get myself through a shift, but to savor the warm float of cream. I walked in the park Jonah and I had frequented, and sometimes I would sit on the bench where his small sneakers had left a dusting of evidence in the grass. Parents would pass with strollers, their faces soft with the kind of love that used my chest like a mirror. At first it was agony to be among such easy joy. Later it felt like a kind of tonic. My life had been rearranged, and while the rearrangement was not a return to what before had been, it had an honesty to it that I had never known. One afternoon, a year after the ruling, we held an event to dedicate a small bench in Jonah's memory in the park. We engraved a simple phrase on a metal plate. For Jonah, with all the suns he drew. The bench, painted a bright stubborn blue, stood near the maple tree we had liked. I held the plaque with 2 hands and felt the weight of permanence. People came. Neighbors, the diner owner, Claire, who grew a fierce pride the way some people grow flowers. Rosa, with her quiet laugh, some of the parents from the workshops. My father stood in the back, an awkward figure who had attempted an apology earlier, which I had accepted the way one accepts the weather, because it is easier than the storms. My mother did not come. I spoke because sometimes grief is not private. Sometimes it is the welding of a broken thing into a bridge others can cross. My voice trembled at first and then steadied. I told Jonah's story, not in the narrative that had been used in court, dry, legal, clinical, but in the details that made him live. His hatred of peas, the way he would build block towers, and then knock them down with a delighted shriek. The crayon suns that had no idea of symmetry, but had all the conviction of a cathedral window. The crowd listened in that way. Crowds listen when they want to honor something larger than themselves. After the ceremony, I lingered. The air had the tinny late summer smell of grass and skates. I walked to the bench and sat. I took the small folded stack of Jonah's drawings with me. People drifted by, chewing on cold paper cups of lemonade. A woman with a stroller asked if she could sit. We started to talk. She had a boy with a cough that rattled like distant thunder. She was here because a friend had told her about the foundation. We talked about doctors and about the guilt that follows every survivor. We created, in that small conversation, an exchange that was both ordinary and strange. 2 strangers stitching the edges of their lives together. The night after the bench dedication, I walked the route Jonah and I had often taken to the small playground by the river. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement like a scattering of tiny, indifferent stars. The world was, in many ways, exactly the same as it had been the day before his death. The same cars, the same distant music, but it felt different by degrees I could not name. I paused by the old swings and traced the metal with the backs of my fingers. I imagined his legs pumping, his face a smear of joy. A woman pushing a toddler on the swing smiled at me, recognition passing in the way of those who acknowledge a shared history. I began to realize that the phrase I had clung to in secret, "I've already outgrown you," was not only about the family who had tried to take from me. It was a recognition of the old self who had bent into impossible shapes for the sake of belonging. There was a new shape emerging, one tempered by grief, but not surrendered to it. I had been forged by loss into someone who could both hold sorrow and continue to make meaning. They did not come back into my life in the way they might have wished. My sister called once more, asking for a meeting, a small truce. I agreed to a coffee because I believed in the dignity of moments, and because coffee was, in some small way, a public record. 2 people in a public cafe cannot commit every kind of wrong. She arrived with an apology that sounded like a script she had read without conviction. I listened and offered a measured response. "I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean trust has to return overnight." She left with a grim little smile. It was enough. Years have a way of not being years, but edits, small revisions to the story we tell ourselves. The foundation grew in modest increments, small grants, a regular donor who had once been a patient liaison at the hospital, a local bakery that donated pastries every month. Rosa and I started a small support group that met in the back room of the diner after closing. I would talk about the technicalities of insurance. She would talk about how to make a shift schedule less punishing when you had to go to the hospital. We learned each other's rhythms in the way people who love each other do, by showing up. On the quiet nights, I walked to the bench by the maple and sat with Jonah's drawings. I would read old texts and picture the way his face had softened in sleep. I would touch the blue of the bench and let the memory sit like a settled thing in my lap. I started to think of family differently, not as a set of people who automatically belong to you, but as a constellation you could choose to place around you. Family could be chosen in the small, repetitive acts: a diner owner who covered a shift, a neighbor who watched your plants, a lawyer who stayed late to file an emergency motion, a coworker who became an ally. They were real and flawed and frequently unglamorous. They were mine. The final resolution was not a moment of revelation, so much as a series of small adjustments. The restraining order that had been issued in court became a practical boundary that kept me safe from manipulative calls and mail. The investigation into the family, into the questionable transfers, ran its course, and there were, for my mother, legal consequences that were as much social as financial. She lost some of the esteem she had bought with performative mourning. My sister, who had entered the courthouse with a practiced face, found fewer people who would lend her scripts. Publicly, they were diminished. Privately, they remained who they were. People who had once loved on terms that were conditional and transactional. One late autumn afternoon, I found a small envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a note, written in a hand that looked like my sister's, and a small photograph of Jonah at a sandbox, his cheeks smeared with cookie crumbs, eyes brighter than a planet on the brink of discovery. The note said, "I'm sorry I left. I'm trying to be better." I folded the note. I read it, and then I burned it in the sink, not as an act of malice, but as an act of preservation. I kept the photograph. I let the past be past, but I did not let it rule me. When winter came, soft, particular, with a thin, brittle sunrise, I walked to the bench and laid out red carnations, the kind that never seemed like much, but always looked like an offering. I spoke to Jonah out loud the way you might speak to someone who is both nowhere and everywhere. I told him about the scholarship, about the small office where a young parent could come in and ask for emergency help, about the tall woman named Rosa, who cursed under her breath when the copier jammed but who always brought a ridiculous dessert. I told him the truth, that I had been stripped and then found the hull of myself again. There was a quiet moment where the wind cut through my jacket and the maple trees stirred like audience. A child somewhere laughed, the sound pure and belonging to someone who had not yet learned about the complicated geometry of people's hearts. The sound went through me like a bell. I let it. "I don't need you anymore," I said into the open light. Not to punish, but to affirm. Not just to my absent family, but to the version of myself that once thought belonging meant allowing people to take. The sentence sat between the maples and the bench like a small, final gift. It was not a statement of cruelty. It was an adoption of truth. Grief did not end. It transformed. It became an ingredient in the life I was still composing, not the composition itself. I learned to hold Jonah's absence like a hand that had its own weather, sometimes stormy, sometimes calm. I learned to answer the phone without flinching. I learned that the people who arrived bearing casseroles were sometimes the ones who kept you fed, and sometimes they were the ones who cut pockets out of jackets and walked away. I learned to choose. If there was a final thing the judge had given me, it was not an order or a piece of paper. It was permission. Permission to continue, on my own terms. Permission to make a family of those who came when it counted. Permission, most of all, to be both broken and becoming, simultaneously tender and fierce. On the bench, under the maples, Jonah's drawings fluttered like flags. A woman pushed her child on a swing nearby, and I watched the small legs launch into air. I closed my eyes and saw, not the ledger of trespass and testimony, but the face of a small boy with a crooked tooth and a laugh like sunlight breaking. The memory was not mine to bury. It was mine to keep. I rose and walked back to the apartment that smelled of lemon cleaner and old hand-me-down blankets. I made coffee and set a small cup on the windowsill, as if he might come by and sit with me. In the quiet that followed, I felt a steadiness return, not the brittle sort, but the slow kind that builds from time and witness and repetition. I had been remade, not whole in the way people sometimes expect, but whole in a way that had been earned. The family that had tried to claim me had taught me unwittingly what my edges were. In reclaiming them, I had finally learned to keep something holy, my own life. The rest of my life rolled forward with small acts of courage. I continued to work the shifts I needed. I continued to fight the fights that needed fighting. I continued to teach and to listen, and to build a memory that was active, not passive. Sometimes, late at night, I climb the stairs to my roof and look at the city lights and think of Jonah. The stars are not the same because he is not, but I see them now in a different grammar, small, precise, enduring. I whisper his name like a prayer, and the night answers back with its own vastness. I had outgrown them, my mother, my sister, their hollowed offering of concern. It was not a triumph of cruelty. It was a slow, clear recognition. I had grown into a life that did not need to be validated by their presence. I had, by surviving and by fighting, by embodying both tenderness and steel, become someone who could write the story of what loss meant and still keep making meaning. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I can hear the echo of the courthouse in the city. Paper shuffling, the small, decisive knock of a gavel. But more often I hear the clatter of dishes at the diner, and the laugh of a woman who just got good news, and the tiny, constant rustle of community. Those noises are smaller, softer music. They hold me in ways velvet and real. At the end of the day, I understand this. You can be both a person who keeps the pieces and a person who is kept by others. You can be the guardian of your own dignity. You can teach yourself to choose the family that shows up, not because blood demands it, but because love earns it. And you can, in the fullest sense, become whole. Not because what was lost came back, but because out of the shattered things you built a place where light could live again.